Hello everyone, I'm zetamath, and this is my setter video. I'm going to take this a little bit differently than other setters have, and rather than talk about how I set a particular puzzle, I'm going to talk more about what defines my style of puzzle and the kind of thing I think about in order to set that kind of puzzle. Now, I'm a relatively new setter, having started just back in November, so part of my pitch here is to try and tell you how I started setting puzzles that people liked fairly quickly, so that if you're a new setter, maybe not super experienced, then hopefully you can take this advice and do the same thing. So before we can come to my experience with setting, I need to tell you a little bit about my experience with puzzles. So I've been playing digital puzzle games for a while, by which I'm thinking about things like Hexels, Temetsky, The Witness. But I hadn't really done much, if any, Sudoku until last year sometime, by which I mean I think once in an airport in 2006 I bought a Sudoku book, and that may have been about the extent of my experience with Sudoku. So I came across the app and the book and the channel, and long story short, I got very into it very quickly during lockdown. So around October of last year, I started watching everything I could find from Cracking the Cryptic and their archive, and I really enjoyed watching all of those videos. Now, I didn't actually do that many puzzles, if any, myself for a long time. And in fact, I really started making puzzles before I actually really started doing puzzles. In fact, really, all the experience I used in setting puzzles was from watching Simon and Mark solve puzzles and seeing the kind of questions they asked and the kind of reasoning they used, and seeing the particular puzzles in there that inspired me. Now, I can point to one exact puzzle that is 100% responsible for me becoming a setter, and that is this puzzle, Philomeno-ish Killer Sudoku by Sir Woozle. In this puzzle, the solver has to construct killer cages to match these given totals, meaning that the solver is really doing two puzzles at once. One is a polyomino puzzle, and one is a Sudoku puzzle. What really grabbed me in this puzzle, though, were these circles. And the rule about these circles was that every killer cage you made had to contain one circle, and the digit in the circle had to be the number of cells that were in that killer cage. So what these circles do is provide an explicit link between the two separate layers of this puzzle. And what I mean by an explicit link here is that you can do Sudoku and conclude that one of the numbers in the circle has to be a 5, which then tells you that this killer cage is a pentomino. Or you can figure out that this killer cage has to be a pentomino, and so therefore this digit has to be 5. And both of these reasonings feed into each other, and that allows for some truly phenomenal deductions. Just from this one video, which was probably the 20th, 30th video I watched, I was hooked. That was the day I joined the setter channel on the Discord, and that was the first day I started trying to set my own puzzle. The first puzzle I set, I just thought to myself, okay, well, I have watched Simon solve this Sir Woozle puzzle. Let me try and set a puzzle with the same rule set. And that taught me a lot. Figuring out, okay, how am I going to do this? What order am I going to do these various steps in? How am I going to set this up? So I did that. It took me a while, but eventually I posted it on the Discord. And then some people did it and gave me some positive feedback and said, hey, this is a good puzzle. So here's my first advice if you're looking to start setting. Find a video that you really like, a puzzle that you really like, that has this really interesting rule set that captivates you for some reason or another, and try and make a puzzle just using those rule sets. You don't really have to vary it. You can just try and make something that is 20% as good as the version that inspired you, and that'll get your feet wet. That'll get you going on setting. And I think that's really a great way to hit the ground running, where you already sort of know at least some of the kinds of deductions that you're allowed to make to put together those pieces into some sort of rule set. Now, from there, I went on to set a bunch of other polyomino circle puzzles with slightly varied rules. The second of those would eventually be featured on the channel. That's Kropke-esque. If you're interested in trying one of these for yourself, I really recommend the third of these, Symmetry, which I think was really the peak of my original work on this kind of style, where I sort of started with this idea from Sir Woozle's puzzle, but then varied it a little bit until I came up with something which I think is rather unique and stands on its own. This sort of trilogy of puzzles that all involved polyominoes and circles and self-description began to set my style as a setter. And if you look at my puzzles, you'll find several things that they all or almost all have in common. So the first thing that they almost all have is a very strong sense of geometry. Usually I'm very explicit that you either have to shade something or find some polyominoes or various things of this sort. Every once in a while not, but almost always I'm interested in an explicit geometric layer. Always, though, I want multiple interlocking layers. So I'm looking for two different pieces of a puzzle that can feed into each other in interesting ways. And third, and this is really what this video is about, all of my puzzles involve a novel rule set. Now, when I say a novel rule set, I want to emphasize I'm not strictly speaking saying it is a rule set that no one has ever used before in the history of humanity. That's not super important. What I mean by a novel rule set is a rule set where the typical person who's solving the puzzle has seen either 0 or 1 puzzle with this rule set before. Now, before I talk about how to set a puzzle with a novel rule set, I want to talk to you a little bit about why you would want to set a puzzle with a novel rule set. And why, in particular, if you are a new setter, even though you might think it would be easier to start with something simpler, I actually think you might have more success starting with a completely novel rule set. So first, I'll start from the solver side. Why do I like solving puzzles with a new rule set? For me, the best part of solving a puzzle is when I figure out some new piece of logic and get to apply it for the first time. Now, there have been a great many puzzles on the channel that use rule sets like Kropke, or Arrow, or Killer, or even Shai's classic Sudoku that let you discover a new piece of logic, even in a puzzle that's set in an incredibly established genre. But I think it is far easier to find new types of logic to apply if it's a rule set that you've never seen before. So let me turn this around and talk about why this is advantageous as a setter. As a setter, you're going to make a puzzle for an audience, for someone to do. Puzzles are made to be solved. You want people to solve them. Now, if you set out to make a killer Sudoku, or an arrow Sudoku, or one of the established genres, then when you post it and some people start to do it, you're going to have people doing it for whom this happens to be their first killer Sudoku, their first arrow Sudoku. But you're equally well going to have people for whom this is their 200th arrow Sudoku, or their 200th killer Sudoku. And that really wide gap in audience makes it really hard to satisfy people at both ends of this spectrum. If, however, you set some sort of wacky snake Sudoku that has a rule no one has ever seen before, then you're guaranteed that every solver who is looking at this puzzle has exactly the same amount of experience with this rule set. And what that does is allows you to create a puzzle that can satisfy a much wider audience simultaneously. If you want to set a killer Sudoku that is going to delight people who've done 200 killer Sudokus, that is going to be very difficult if you yourself have not done 200 killer Sudokus. And this is what previous setters have alluded to when they've talked about how if you want to set great puzzles, you have to solve great puzzles first. If, however, you set a puzzle with a novel rule set, then you already know as much as your solver is going to know. And in fact, by the time you're actually done with the puzzle, you'll know a great deal more than your solver is actually going to know when they approach the puzzle. Setting puzzles with novel rule sets is a great way to get started setting Sudoku puzzles that people will enjoy, even if you yourself are not a great Sudoku solver. Even if you don't already know what a Y-wing is, or an empty rectangle, or a jellyfish, or an exocet, or any of these other things, it will get you able to start setting up these kinds of webs of logic right away. So next, I want to talk about what makes a good novel rule set. So the very first thing is you want the rule set to be as simple as possible and as easy to understand as possible. One big problem with setting puzzles with novel rule sets is that in order to solve it, someone has to read the directions to the puzzle. And if you post a puzzle in the Discord whose rule set is 6 paragraphs long, no matter how wonderful the puzzle is, probably no one is even going to get to the second paragraph and reading it, much less solve it. So you really want to keep to simple, and particularly you want it to be that once someone has read it, they go, ah, I get it, that's cool. Not, let me read that again, and let me read it again. Okay, now I think maybe I get it. Someone who reads your directions and immediately thinks, ah, I've never seen something like that before. That sounds cool. I can do that. Or, oh, that's neat. I never thought of that. That kind of thing is what you're really looking for when you're looking for a novel rule set. The next requirement is that you're looking for a restriction or a rule that is not so restrictive that it is difficult to find grids that satisfy it. If you don't know if there's even a single finished grid that will satisfy your constraint, that probably means it's not a good rule set to try and set for, because it's going to give you very little flexibility when you're setting. On the other hand, you need to make sure that your rule set is restrictive enough, or robust enough, that it allows for interesting deductions. I'll talk a little bit more when I talk about the process of creating one of these puzzles, about how you can make sure that your system is robust enough. I'll note you would love a rule that interacts nicely either with regular Sudoku or with a usual variant of Sudoku. So it's not too uncommon to take a new rule and combine it with Kropki, or combine it with Killer, or Arrow, or what have you. So if you can already think, okay, I have this new rule set, or this new rule idea, but that actually would interact in an interesting way with, and then something more vanilla, that will help make your puzzle more approachable, because a lot of people will have seen that variant before, but they'll still get the joy of discovering all of the new logic that comes with your new rule. Next, I think it's really important that whatever idea you have, that idea can be presented in a way that is aesthetically pleasing. Now, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and there's an enormous amount of subjectivity to what exactly creates a beautiful grid, but if someone looks at the photo of your grid and it just looks like a mess, they're just going to move on to the next puzzle. So pay attention to what the grids you'll make with this constraint or these rules look like. So the last piece of advice I'll give you is that you want to avoid global constraints. And what do I mean about a global constraint? I mean some sort of rule that's true across the entire grid. So both non-consecutive and anti-night are examples of global constraints. And both of those are famously difficult to set among setters. And the reason why these are difficult to set is that it's incredibly easy to box yourself into a puzzle that has no solutions. And it's incredibly easy to box yourself into that actually very quickly. At the beginning, you'll say, this is really interesting. I have a 3 here, so this thing can't be an 8. Great. But now, as you get to the later part of the puzzle, you'll realize, actually, I've already broken the puzzle. Actually, as soon as I put 3 clues into the puzzle, it was broken and I just didn't know it. So rather, I would encourage you to use local constraints. That is, something you mark in the grid that indicates some particular kind of information. So, a Kropke dot, a killer cage, an arrow, or variations of any of those. Take whatever version you want, just something that's marked in the grid that says these digits that touch this particular clue satisfy this particular rule. Those kinds of clues will give you a lot of flexibility, and they'll make sure that it's very rare that you're breaking your puzzle from early on. Now I want to talk through what the process of actually setting a puzzle is like. And I'm going to break this into 3 parts, which I'm uncreatively going to call the beginning, the middle, and the end. And then we'll talk some about what you do after the puzzle is done. So where do you start setting a Sudoku with a novel rule set? Here's the first piece of advice. Don't decide the rule set before you start setting the puzzle. Rather, decide the rules as you set the puzzle. So you want to start really with just a rough idea of the space you want to play around with. Maybe one formulation of a rule, but don't get married to this rule before you've started setting the puzzle. So once you have this rough idea of what this rule you want to work with is, try and make out a grid where you can find one deduction for the solver to make that is interesting to you. So just put enough stuff with this clue in the grid that you can place 1 digit, shade 1 cell, do whatever it is that's going to be part of your puzzle. Now, as weird as it sounds, this is a huge percentage of actually the entire process is just getting to the point where there's 1 step that you're happy with. And that's really where you want to start, is figuring out that 1 step, that 1 interaction, that 1 deduction that gets everything started. If you're having trouble getting this 1 set, remember that you can vary your rules or add a rule. This might be where you realize, actually, I really want something like a killer cage or like an arrow or like a Kropke. Any of these things you can add, or maybe you want to slightly change the way your rules work, add an additional rule, take it away, these sorts of things, until you get to this 1 first step that you're happy with. Please note, it is very likely that the place you end up will be miles away from the place you started. The more willing you are to change your idea or vary your idea, the easier this will be. But don't be surprised if you end up in a place that's totally different or totally unrecognizable from the place you started. So as an example, I want to tell you about Shapes, which is a puzzle that Mark did on the channel, although when he did it, it was called Colors. And the way this puzzle works is that at the top of the puzzle, there are these 3 pills that tell you the sum of all of the cells that have a square, all of the cells that have a circle, and all of the cells that have a diamond. And the only other rule, aside from the XV rules, is that no digit repeats within squares, no digit repeats within diamonds, and no digit repeats within circles. So where did this puzzle idea start? Well, believe it or not, the original seed of an idea for this puzzle was, hey, wouldn't it be cool if there was a puzzle with killer cages, but where you have to write the total of the killer cage in the cage? And if you remember earlier, I talked about these layers that interact through some sort of self-description. This is exactly that. Writing the cage total in as digits in the grid is layering two different pieces together so that you get this beautiful interaction between the killer part on one side and the Sudoku part on the other. Now, if you've watched the channel a lot, you've probably seen a number of variations on this idea. Here's one by Quinlux, here's one by Demano, and there are various other variations on this theme. Now, when I first set out to do this, what I realized was something that actually shows up in both of those puzzles that I just mentioned, which is that if you write the total in the cage, then the singles digit doesn't matter. Because, for example, in this cage, if the total is 12, well, then if I change this 2 to a 3, the total is now 13, the total is now 14 if I change it to a 4. This digit could be literally anything, and has no impact on the total. A lot of people's puzzles in this have really leaned heavily on this deduction, and it's a very cool idea, but it wasn't what I wanted. I wanted something where it felt like, hey, I'm really sort of filling in the total for this cage. So what was my next idea? Well, my next idea was going to be to have some killer cages scattered throughout the grid and have some pills over on the right side of the grid that would record the sums of the killer cages, and you would have to match them. And so in my mind, in this puzzle, the solver would have to realize, oh, this cage has to match with this pill because... And that's where I got stuck, because I couldn't really figure out a because. But there's actually an even bigger problem with this grid that I've laid out. Namely, I realized pretty quickly when I was trying to set this puzzle, if I line up these pills like this, the first digit of the total of a killer cage is always 1, 2, 3, or 4. And so as a result, if I wanted to have my pills over in this column, I could have at most 4 2-digit pills, because as soon as I had 4, I'd already run out of possibilities. Now, though, you can probably see how you could get from this idea to the idea that Shapes was actually based on. I realized that what I could do was use this deduction that the first digits had to be from 1, 2, 3, 4, put 3 pills in a row, and then scatter the cages all across the grid. And so in my mind, as I'm setting this, really what's going on is all of the circles form one killer cage that's just been broken across the grid. And the same is true for the squares and the diamonds. And that's the origin of the perhaps slightly strange rule that all the circles contain a different digit, because that's how killer cages work. Now, almost immediately, once I had this idea, and I put these 3 pills up here just because it seemed like the most symmetrical, aesthetically pleasing place to put them, I realized something I had not realized before, which was that the digit after the 4, wherever it went, also had to come from 1, 2, 3, or 4. Which meant that actually I had a virtual 1, 2, 3, 4 quadruple in the first row, which actually gave me sort of my break-in for this puzzle before I even really had set any of the puzzle. And that moment when I saw this logic connecting these things in this exciting way that I had not really foreseen myself, that's when I knew, okay, this puzzle's going to work out. To come full circle on this story, later, once I thought of the pill idea, I came back and actually set a puzzle with pills intersecting the cages with almost exactly the original rule set I had in mind for the puzzle that shapes was going to be at the start. And in this puzzle, all you're asked to do is fill in the total of each killer cage in the little pill that intersects it. So the idea that I sort of let go of, eventually I was able to make work once I thought of the right other ideas and once I became more skilled as a setter overall. So when I say the first thing you should do with your rule set is try and make a grid where you can have one deduction that you're happy with, that can be a long process. It's not as easy as it sounds. But once you get that one deduction, quite often you can figure out how to make another, and another, and another. And really, that's how you start laying out your grid. You find this one deduction that you're happy with, and then you just add clues here or there to let you extend that deduction into further deductions that you're happy with. And quite often, once you got the first one, the next few go in pretty rapidly. One of the most difficult of the puzzles to figure this out for me was the puzzle Ambiguity. The idea of ambiguity is that you have all of these things, but the rule is each of these things is either a thermo, meaning the digits on it increase from the bulb end to the tip, or it's an arrow, meaning the number in the question mark is the sum of all of the other numbers. For this puzzle, almost the entire setting process was figuring out how I was going to get someone to make the first deduction. After having had this idea for well over a week, I finally stumbled on this arrangement. And the clever thing about this arrangement is that whether this is a thermometer or an arrow, the number that's in this circle can only go in the bottom row of this box. And the number that's in this circle can only go in the top row of this box. And what's beautiful about that is if you think about it, it tells you these two things can't both be thermos. Because if they were both thermos, this would be telling you that simultaneously x is greater than y, because x is further along the y thermo, but also y is greater than x, because y is further along the x thermo. And that is not possible. It's a little easier to see that these two things can't both be arrows, because if they were both arrows, these circles would need to sum to at least 21 by usual arrow logic, and that's not going to work. So I finally had a grid where I was able to make a non-trivial deduction with this rule set. And really, I'm being completely honest with you if I say, from here, the rest of the puzzle more or less set itself. This was the key step. While you're playing around with a new rule set, you really just want to try and draw stuff, maybe at random, as you get a feel for how your rule set works, what kinds of deductions and arrangements are possible. There are a lot of things that are probably true about your rule set that you won't realize at first, and realizing them is basically what you want your solver to do. So you have to figure those things out yourself first. As you're fleshing out your puzzle and adding a clue or two, keep in mind that at this point the grid is wide open, so probably you can shift things around, rotate them, change some digits, etc. You have a lot of freedom, and so in order to facilitate adding extra clues that you want, you can basically move stuff wherever you want. One way to really help you do this is once you have a few steps of logic, you can just reset your puzzle and start solving it yourself and go through the logical steps that you have envisioned. And what you'll notice is you sort of almost subconsciously start to think about, what am I going to look at next as the solver? And putting yourself in the solver's head like that gives you a sense of where to put the next clue or the next piece of information that will help push the solver on to get the next piece of your puzzle and the next piece of the puzzle and so on. One thing you're doing as you set the puzzle is you're asking questions. In the case of ambiguity, that question is very literal. Is this thing an arrow or is it a thermo? But a lot of times, the questions will be more subtle, and that's okay too. For example, in this puzzle, we immediately identify that these two cells are a 4-6 pair. This particular cell looks into both of these boxes, so we're particularly keen to know which of these digits it is. I want to point out that as you're setting, you want to be conscious of asking these questions. You want the solver to have things they want to know but don't. The secret, though, is that as the setter, you don't actually need to know the answer to the question. Eventually, the question will answer itself. In fact, I actually make this analogy that this is a lot like the advice they give authors when you're writing a book. If you start writing a book knowing what the ending is going to be, you're not going to be surprised, and so the reader's not going to be surprised either. If you want to write a book with a genuinely surprising outcome, you have to set events in motion and just let things happen so that you're as surprised as you hope the eventual reader will be. In the same way, as a setter, it's a really good sign if you're surprised by the way things work out. Because almost certainly that means the person solving your puzzle will be surprised, and it's always a really neat moment when you're solving a puzzle and you're almost certain that this thing has to be a thermo, and it turns out to be an arrow, or whatever the version of this for your puzzle is. Like I said before, while you're in the intro phase, don't get too attached to anything. Because anything you've done, you can scrap, you can redo, you can move it around. Really, the whole point of this introductory phase is for you to learn the rule set that you've created, learn the language, learn the tips and tricks, and the types of logical deductions that your solver is someday going to be making when they set down to do this puzzle. Once you've got this series of introductory steps to begin your puzzle that you're happy with and you feel yourself growing sentimentally attached to, even though I told you not to in the previous part, and you pretty much know what the rules are going to be, you've entered the phase that I'm going to call mid-design. At this point, you'll have filled in a decent part of the grid. You'll have a decently long sort of solve path in mind. But now a few concerns that weren't there in the beginning phase start to creep in. The first is that once you figure out a way to make a deduction with your rule set, it is really easy to use that same deduction over and over and over again. And I'd encourage you to try as much as possible not to use the same deduction more than a handful of times in a puzzle. If you do, it starts to get repetitive. I mentioned earlier my love of self-referential rules. This is a place where they're great, because they can really let you make a really wide array of deductions by filling in the value of a circle, or knowing something about the shading, or etc., etc. They give you a bunch of different directions of inference between a bunch of different kinds of rules, and that's really exciting. If you do end up finding that your rule set maybe doesn't have that many kinds of deduction, and you do have to use the same one repeatedly, one way to make it exciting is to make it so that you're using the deduction on progressively further away cells in the grid. Anytime you're able to deduce something in box 9 affecting something in box 2 in a Sudoku puzzle, that's just exciting and fun. So that's always a great way to sort of extend the novelty of a particular sort of deduction that you have in mind. One important thing to also remember as you're setting these puzzles is this is ultimately a Sudoku puzzle. So one way to vary the kinds of deductions that are being used is to just use Sudoku. That is, you don't have to use your new constraint for everything. You could add a given digit that lets you deduce something through regular Sudoku, or lets you find a triple, or lets you make some other step. So don't forget, all of those tools are at your disposal as well. Another concern that creeps in around mid-design is that you start to worry that maybe you're creating a puzzle that actually has no solutions. I would really encourage you to, around mid-design, start consistently making sure that with every clue you add, you're not breaking the puzzle. That is, the puzzle still has a solution. Here is where I get to plug one of the best tools for setting Sudoku puzzles. And this is where I suggest you go if after watching this video you think, hey, I can do this. Namely, go to fpuzzles.com. This site is run by Eric Fox, and it does an awful lot of things excellently for you. The thing I want to talk about right now is this solve button. So if you're in the middle of a puzzle and you've got a bunch of things floating around, you can hit this solve button, and what it will do is it will give you a solution to your puzzle. Or it may tell you this puzzle has no solutions. In either event, you're pretty happy because you either know, hey, my puzzle has a solution, or you've saved yourself an inordinate amount of work because fpuzzles has told you that you actually added a clue that broke your puzzle, and as long as you're doing this routinely throughout, you won't get too far out over your skis in a direction that you don't want to go. fpuzzles is pre-programmed to handle an awful lot of constraints that you might see in your standard puzzles. So it can do arrows, killer cages, it can do anti-diagonal, anti-knight, non-consecutive. All of these various types of things that you might want to do, you can just put those in and fpuzzles will be able to solve for them. However, it's very natural for you at this point to think, yeah, but zetamath, this whole video is about setting puzzles with new rule sets. How do you use this for puzzles with new rule sets? And for that, you have to get a bit creative at times. One helpful way is that if your rule set allows it, you can manually pencil mark all the possibilities in any given cell. And as long as you go in Settings and check the box that says Treat Pencil Marks as Given, then immediately fpuzzles will just say, okay, I don't need to know what your rule is, I just need to know this cell can only be 2, 4, or 8, and it can go with that. Quite often, when I'm setting a puzzle, I'll have 2 or 3 different instances of fpuzzles open in different tabs, keeping track of the different layers of the puzzle, trying to keep straight how all of these different pieces work. One example of just to show you that you can get a little creative with this, when I was setting Ambiguity, I had one window where I was setting it exactly what it would look like to the hypothetical solver, and I was solving along with it as I added clues I'd fill in, and I'd mark once I knew something was an arrow, or once I knew something was a thermo, and what digits I knew it was, and so on and so forth. But I had a second secret window where I actually had the arrows or thermos marked into the grid, and so I could verify that at least one combination of arrows and thermos was still solvable. Another tool I want to draw your attention to here is the Solution Path button. So solve, that we talked about before, gives you a solution to your puzzle as it currently exists. Solution path does all the Sudoku logic it can think of to find everything that it can find that can be deduced from the clues that you've given it. As I mentioned before, I'm not the best at Sudoku, but even if you are, when you're setting, you're often in a different headspace. And so your solving in parallel with your setting is not necessarily paying attention to everything, especially as you add and modify some clues. And so it can be really helpful to know, based on the clues that you've given so far, is there any deduction that I have missed that's already forced? So if you click this button and it fills in a 3 here, it's telling you this is a deducible piece of information. And in fact, if you want to, you can read out exactly how that piece of information was deduced. This is especially useful if you're setting in something like anti-night, where often there's really elaborate strings of deductions that can be hard to see. This helps you keep your own grid at sort of the maximum amount of information that you could deduce from the clues that you have. Earlier, when we talked about what makes good rules, I mentioned that you want to make sure your set of constraints isn't too tight or too loose. And this is where that trade-off really starts to hit home. If your set of rules is too restrictive, you're going to find yourself running over and over and over again into a puzzle that has no solutions. If, on the other hand, your set of rules is too loose, you're going to find that in the beginning phase, when you try and set a deduction to get everything rolling, you're going to have to add way too many clues to the grid to even get started. Here's a pattern I find myself falling into all the time. I come up with a rule set that I think I like, but it's not quite restrictive enough. And in this situation, I always think, I know what I'll do. I'll add an anti-night constraint. I like anti-night constraints. And so that will take something from being unrestrictive to being incredibly restrictive, and that will allow a ton of deductions right at the beginning. But then I get to this step, and suddenly everything in my entire grid is forced by this chain of deductions that I would never wish upon anyone, and any clue I try and add to the grid just immediately breaks the puzzle. So then I go back and I remove the anti-night constraint and I go do something else. This is just to say there's a trade-off, and having super restrictive rules will make the beginning phase easier, but will make this middle phase harder for you. Now, when you break your puzzle, which you will, it's not that big of a deal. As long as you're checking often, you can just go back a step or two, and once you go back a step or two, then you go back to something that was solvable, and then you find a different clue. And then maybe if you can't find any clue you really like, you go back another step or two and another step or two until you find something where, this is a natural path forward, and then you can go forward from there. But when you break your puzzle, before you hit that rewind button, there's something else I think you should really do, which is to make sure you understand logically why your puzzle is broken. F-puzzles, if it tells you your puzzle has no solutions, will give you a path that sort of explains why, if you follow through all of this, suddenly there's no number that can be placed in this box, so the puzzle's broken. But usually that's not really the heart of why your puzzle's broken. I think it really is in your best interest when you break your puzzle to understand how you would explain to someone why this puzzle has no solutions. In fact, actually, you'll see this is a very common exercise that people will post back and forth in the Setters channel in the Discord, is here's a puzzle, prove it has no solutions. And usually there's some slick 2 or 3 line argument that, hey, this can't have a solution because, and then some neat insight. And the reason why it's in your interest to figure out that reason before rewinding is because that deduction that stopped you from being able to add this clue or put a 3 in this cell or whatever it happened to be is a deduction that could have been made on the grid before you added the clue. And in particular, it might be a really interesting deduction that you could use as part of the solve path for your puzzle. A lot of the really cool layouts or really cool deductions that I managed to find, I really discover through breaking my own puzzles. And that I'm able to use that piece that I broke and the logic that goes with it to then go back and add a neat step to my intended solve path for the puzzle. So actually, breaking your puzzle can be a huge gift in terms of showing you a piece of logic that was previously invisible to you. I'll repeat what I said earlier, which is that at many times throughout the process of setting, you want to start your puzzle from the very beginning and go through all the steps that you sort of have in mind, go through the logic that you have in mind, and see what it feels like. If you dread solving your own puzzle, that's a bad sign. You want to be at a point where you still feel like that kind of excitement as you make these deductions, even though you're the one who set them up. And if you're not really happy with it, if you feel like it's repetitive or tedious or not quite right, you can just start over. Setting isn't a race. Take your time. Get something you're really happy with and make something great. But don't get discouraged. This difficulty happens to everyone. And a lot of these great puzzles that you see take people weeks to set. So don't get discouraged if you're taking days on something and you don't feel like you're really getting anywhere. As long as you're learning something, you're making good progress. Never be afraid to scrap what you're doing and start over from the beginning. Any time you spend trying to set is valuable because it makes you a better setter, it teaches you more kinds of logic, and it puts more tools in your toolbox that you'll be able to use for later puzzles. As you think of ideas, and as you throw away ideas as you're making your puzzles or don't use them or whatever, just keep yourself a list of ideas you've had. I just have a draft of an email to myself with a couple hundred ideas now. Everything I throw away just ends up in this list, and if I'm ever looking for inspiration, I'll just skim the list, and sometimes something will strike me, and some of my puzzles will end up being really inspired by ideas from way long ago. So the basic rule idea of a Ouroboros, which is one of my most recent puzzles, came from one of the first ideas I had when I started setting. So just keep in mind all of these ideas that you have, even if they're not useful for you right now, they might be useful later. Also, I find just psychologically, rejecting an idea is easier if rather than just rejecting it into the ether, you reject it into a draft, even if you never end up using it later. Now I want to talk about late design. Now let me describe what I mean by late design. What I mean is that you have a grid that's now really cramped. At first, the grid is these 81 cells full of possibility, but now you've got clues everywhere, and it's really hard to add another clue, and nearly anything you do, you find is breaking the puzzle. At this point, you might even be starting to worry that if you add too many more clues, your grid is not going to look very pretty. And at this point, you've already made an awful lot of deductions, and you're probably pretty happy with it and feel like you've probably made it through the majority of what the solver is going to experience when they solve your puzzle. Here is where I'm going to recommend you do something that every single video from a setter I've seen so far has said not to do, which is to pick a solution for your puzzle and then just force it. That is to say, find a solved state that your puzzle satisfies, using perhaps this lovely solve button, and then add a clue or two or three just to get your puzzle to solve into that solution. I'm definitely not saying to do that from the beginning. I don't even think it's a good idea to do it in the middle, but I think to get those last few steps of your puzzle, I think this is a really valuable tool. Now, I want to note a feature of F puzzles that I use all the time, which is that once you hit the solve button, you can actually hit the solve button again and again and again. And when you do that, it will cycle through a bunch of different solutions to the puzzle that you have given it. And so when you're picking what you want the eventual solved grid to be so that you can finish your puzzle, you don't have to pick at random. You can pick something that actually works nicely with your constraint. So, just as an example, if you're setting something that's using, say, X's and V's, you might cycle through some possible solutions until two digits next to each other line up that add to 10 so that you can add a little X there, and maybe that'll finish up the puzzle. In this last step is where it is really useful to have that vanilla constraint that's flexible and doesn't draw the eye too heavily, like Kropke or XV or these kinds of things, because those will let you really unobtrusively get to a unique solution at the end of your puzzle. Even if you haven't used one of those constraints, you might consider at this point adding one Kropke dot, one X or V, or even a given digit, just to get your puzzle to that point of resolving to a unique solution. You'll often see in puzzles, and you'll see Simon and Mark comment on this a lot, that, oh, there's one Kropke dot here, there's one two-cell thermo here, that's just to disambiguate the end piece. That's all they're saying, and there's nothing wrong with that if you're really happy with the rest of your grid. So, now your puzzle is done, or at least you have a draft of your puzzle. If you haven't done so already, write a careful list of the rules of your puzzle. Now, if you followed my advice up until this point, you've probably actually shifted around those rules a few different times, and I've done this to myself a bunch of times. It's really easy to accidentally rely on a deduction based on a rule in the early part that you change later. So write down your rules carefully, commit to them, and then do a test solve for yourself from scratch. Start with a blank version of your puzzle, and make sure you can follow it through using only a logical path to a unique solution. If you have a habit of using uniqueness tricks when solving puzzles normally, make sure you don't do that here, because part of what you're doing with this test solve is proving to yourself that your puzzle actually has a unique solution. One last thing to pay attention to as you solve your puzzle a time or two or three at the end is if there are any parts of the solve that you don't enjoy. So perhaps your puzzle solves uniquely and you really love almost all the steps, but at one point in the middle, you have to enumerate 12 different possibilities for a cage and rule 11 of them out, and that's just kind of annoying. In the event that happens, I would encourage you to add a clue to your grid just so that the solver doesn't have to do that. Now, you'll see people often complain about redundant clues, but if you do this, likely most solvers will not even notice that you saved them from having to enumerate some whole bunch of possibilities. For example, this puzzle Ouroboros, it has a unique solution if you do not put this 9 here. However, I can all but guarantee you this puzzle would not have been featured on the channel if it did not have this 9 here. So get to the point where you're really happy with solving the puzzle from start to finish. Now, here's a couple things that you'll hear people talk about that I think you shouldn't worry about basically at all through this entire process. One is difficulty. If your puzzle works out to be easy and it's fun, great. If your puzzle works out to be hard and it's fun, great. You're going to be so deep into this puzzle by the time you're done setting it, you're going to have absolutely no idea how easy or hard it is. And in fact, that's one thing I always rely on other people to tell me before I post it on something like Logic Masters Germany. Just don't worry about it. If the puzzle wants to be easy, make it easy. If the puzzle wants to be hard, make it hard. Just don't think about it. Another thing you hear people talk about a lot is a linear solve path. That is, you'll hear people talk a lot about how they want someone to see this step, and then this step, and then this step, and then this step, in this particular order, and they're really happy with all the logical steps that they've made. And they want the solver to have the same experience. And so a lot of setters are really concerned about making sure there's no shortcuts, no different logic that might get you to the solution without using the intended solution path. And I don't think you should worry about that, because as long as the person who's solving the puzzle has fun, it really doesn't matter if they have the same kind of fun that you intended for them to have, or if they had a completely different kind of fun. One thing that confused me when I started setting is that a lot of people who did my puzzles would tell me they really loved the linear solve paths that I had put into them.
And what I loved about it was how linear it felt. So each deduction, definitely seemed to lead on very naturally to the next.
Which was always funny to me, because then I would see their solve path and it would look absolutely nothing like my solve path. So what were they really telling me when they said they enjoyed the linear solve path? What they were really saying was they found the steps that they took were fun and natural and interesting, and seemed to follow from one another. As long as that happens, it doesn't matter what path they take. If they have fun, your puzzle has done its job. Okay, so you have a version of your puzzle that you're happy with. You have a draft. You've test solved it multiple times. You've smoothed out any rough parts. You think it's fun. You think it's neat. You're happy with it. What do you do now? Well, the obvious answer is get other people to solve the puzzle. And one great place to do that is on the Cracking the Cryptic Discord. If you get the setter role, it'll give you access to a puzzle setting chat room, and will also give you access to a channel where you can post a puzzle and get other people to solve it for you. I know when you're starting, finding someone to test your puzzle can be really hard. If you're a new setter, you may have to ask someone to do your puzzle, or you might have to trade and say, I'll do yours if you do mine, or whatever. You just want other people to do your puzzle. But the good news is, the more puzzles you make, and the more people enjoy your puzzles, the easier it becomes to find someone to agree to test your puzzles. This is one reason, though, why you really want to put your best product forward and present your most polished, best work that you possibly can with your early puzzles. Because you want people who've tested your first puzzle to be willing to test your second and your third, and those beyond that. If you're really lucky, you'll eventually find some friends in the Sudoku community who will be happy to test your puzzles on a regular basis. Thank you to my regular testers, Jetty and Sir Woozle, who have both very generously given their time and tested every puzzle I've sent since almost the very beginning. I really appreciate it. Having some people test your puzzle before you post it in some big public forum serves a few purposes. First, it checks how well written your rules are. Especially if you're using a new rule set, it may be very easy for you to decide what the words you're talking about mean, but it may not translate so well to the way you've written it. When I started setting, I feel like I got 1,000,000 comments about every puzzle I posted with the rules. For whatever reason, that seems not to happen as often anymore. I'm not quite sure why, but this is just an excellent place to make sure that when you do post it, wherever you end up posting it, that people will be able to understand what the puzzle actually asks. Next, it checks the logic that you've used in solving the puzzle. Now, I've suggested that you test solve your puzzle multiple times before you give it to people, even to a tester to check. And that's a good idea. But we're all human. And so it's very possible that even despite our best efforts, we've made a mistake somewhere. If you do your puzzle over and over again, it's very possible that if you make one step incorrectly, you'll be more than happy to make the same incorrect step 4 more times when you test solve your puzzle. So every once in a while, that'll happen. Another easy to miss thing is if your puzzle has a negative constraint. That is, if you promise all dots are given or all circles are given or whatever, no matter how many times you check it, it is so easy to miss one. And I have made this mistake a couple times when I've sent something off to a tester. I have promised that all of a particular type of information was given when actually it wasn't. If someone else solves your puzzle, it verifies the logic works, and as long as they get the same solution you do, it verifies that the solution of your puzzle is unique. The people who solve your puzzle can give you a sense of how difficult they found the puzzle. Knowing the difficulty is somewhat important for when you actually publish your puzzle, because you want to communicate to the potential audience who the puzzle is for. Usually you'll communicate difficulty as a rating from 1 to 5, where 1 means the puzzle should be incredibly, incredibly easy, and 5 means the puzzle should take Simon an hour. So you can balance along there, but there's also pieces of information like what techniques are used and these kinds of things. Again, it's better to get this sense from someone else, because you set the puzzle, you're probably going to have a hard time understanding what the difficulty is. One last thing that you want to look out for when someone is giving you feedback on your puzzle is you want to make sure that the puzzle didn't have any weird spikes in difficulty. If your puzzle is mostly straightforward, but then in the middle you have to use a finned swordfish or some really advanced solving technique, that's probably something you want to smooth out. Again, I said not to worry about difficulty, but you want someone who's enjoying your puzzle to be able to finish it. And so if your test solver points out, hey, this one step felt really out of line with the difficulty of the rest, you might want to smooth that out. Having more than one person test your puzzle is really helpful here. The general guideline is you want at least 2 people to solve your puzzle before you post it in the general community. And that's part of this, is that if someone has a really hard time spotting a step, but the other person doesn't even notice that that is difficult, that's probably a sign it's fine the way it is. We all have strengths and weaknesses, and some days we just don't see that there's already a 2 in row 2. That just happens. But if a couple different testers each comment on the fact that one step was especially difficult, you might want to consider a way to rewrite your puzzle just a smidge to make that step easier. After your puzzle's been tested, and you're happy with it, and the people who've tested it are relatively happy with it, then you should share your puzzle. Cracking the Cryptic has the Discord Puzzle Archive. And the Discord Puzzle Archive is an amazing place which has tons of puzzles by tons of amazing setters. And once you've had your puzzle tested by 2 people, that's a great place to put it. And there, people will keep finding it for a long time. Even months later, I still see people solving my puzzles from the Discord Puzzle Archive. If you're really, really happy with a puzzle, and a bunch of people have solved it, and they also are very happy with it, you can consider posting your puzzle on Logic Masters Germany, which is probably the most prestigious public place, at least that I'm aware of, to post your puzzles. Generally, I only put my best of my best puzzles there. Some of them I'll just put in the Discord Puzzle Archive, or some of them I just won't show anyone. Previous setters have said, if you want to make great puzzles, solve great puzzles. I'll say, if you want to make great puzzles, watch people solve great puzzles. I think you can learn an enormous amount by watching people solve other puzzles. Seeing what kinds of things make people happy when they're solving puzzles, what kinds of things make people excited, that's a great way to improve your own setting. So I really think watching this channel, watching Ranks' stream, there are various other places where you can watch people solving puzzles. I think that's a great way to level up as a setter. One of the most common comments I see on YouTube videos for my puzzles on Cracking the Cryptic is people saying that my puzzle was the first puzzle from a 40-plus minute video that they ever solved by themselves. Novel rule sets narrow the gap between new solvers and experienced solvers, allowing more people to enjoy them. And they allow inexperienced solvers to set puzzles that even experienced solvers can enjoy. I hope if you've watched this video all the way through and you've never set a puzzle before, that you'll give it a try. I can't wait to see what you all create.